Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer, artist, editor, educator, Carl Potts. Carl, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks for having me.
You were an editor at Marvel at a time when I guess they were the big dog in the industry in the 1980s, and you had the opportunity to sort of shepherd in a lot of new talent, folks like June Brigman, like Arthur Adams, like Jim Lee. And I'm just wondering, as an editor, how is it that you can help an artist sort of figure out how the system works and how to get better?
Well, I think the fact that I was both a writer and an artist was very helpful. And I would look, since I remembered what it was like when I was trying to break in, and I'd send in my samples and either get no response or get a response ages later that was a form letter that usually told me nothing useful. I decided when I became an editor, anybody who sent me their portfolio or their samples directly to me, not to Marvel in general, but directly to me, or if I saw them at a convention, they were going to get a quick response that told them something useful. And by doing that, occasionally I'd run across people who showed advanced talent but weren't quite ready to be professionals yet. So I try and discern where their weaknesses were and give them exercises or resources to try and beef up those areas. And for those who were getting really close, I gave them a 6-page Tom DeFalco story that was incredibly hard to do. In 6 pages, a lot of storytelling condensed into 6 pages, and that was a sort of trial by fire, throwing them into the deep end of the pool. And we paid them $60 a page to pencil it, even though they never got published. And they'd do the layouts, and I'd go over the layouts and have changes made, and I'd do the pencils, and I'd go over that. And then if they went on to inks, I'd do the same thing. And it was a learning process that way. And some people, were just so sharp when they came in the door that we just gave them work right off the bat. Brigman had met Louise Simonson, and they got together to create Power Pack. And when Louise Simonson asked me to edit the book, she showed me June's stuff, and I was blown away by it. So she basically pretty much started her career. And strangely enough, the person that followed her on the book, John Bogdanov, was a similar thing. He came up to Marvel, showed his portfolio. I needed someone to replace June, who was moving on to other books, and trying to find people who could draw children well in comics was very difficult. All these amazing artists that draw all of these amazing things, and their children really were ugly. John Bogdanov came up and had a portfolio full of samples of sword and sorcery stuff, which I didn't really need. But then this piece of paper he'd done a sketch on of some kids slipped out of his portfolio, and I said, that we can use, and that was the start of his career. So it's a little different now. I'm a little harder to get in. You can't just make appointments to see people or send your stuff in, because people are worried now, that the companies are worried now about people claiming that you stole their ideas or whatever if you send in ideas or samples or whatever. So it's gotten much harder in that regard, unfortunately.
Now, you mentioned Power Pack, which was one of those great innovative series of the 1980s. And when you're brought in as an editor and you've got a writer who's got this concept, what do you bring to the table that's going to help, in this case, Louise Simonson, really refine it and make it as good as it was?
Well, with Power Pack, I was very lucky because Louise Simonson is one of the best writer-editors in the field to begin with. One of the first main contributions I made is she had a different name for the series. And the reasons behind that name were very clever, but I thought they weren't, since you weren't going to be there whispering in the ears of potential buyers about how clever this name was, I thought on face value it was kind of off-putting or misleading. So I came up with the name Power Pack, and Wheezy really liked that. And when June was designing a lot of her characters, she did an excellent job on the kids. She was having some trouble with some of the aliens and with the Smart Ship Friday, so I did a lot of work on those as well. And with June, I would go over her pencils or her layouts and make sure all the storytelling was clear. and so on. So it's just basically every step of the creative process. An editor goes in and makes sure that the creators are telling the story in a clear and compelling way. And if there are problems, ideally you come up with possible solutions to pitch to them. Whether that ends up being the final solution to the issue may or may not be the case, because you basically want to creatively brainstorm with your people to come up with the best solution, no matter where it comes from.
Now, when you're working on a new series like Power Pack, I guess it's going to be different than when you are handed an established franchise like, let's say, The Incredible Hulk. So when you have a character that has a long history, as a new editor, how do you sort of step in and say, you know, this is the direction we want to go in because maybe the old direction's getting a little stale, or maybe this new writer that you're going to work with has some great ideas?
Well, when I inherited characters to edit like Doctor Strange and the Hulk and so on, later on Alpha Flight, with Doctor Strange and the Hulk, I'd been reading them for decades at that point. So I knew a lot of what was going on. I needed to catch up on some of the recent history, but I would go back and reread almost everything to just make sure I knew what had been done before, so we didn't accidentally retrace certain steps or storylines, and see if there were things in there that I thought hadn't been explored properly, or just, I believe a large part of creativity is juxtaposing things together in new and interesting ways, and following what if kind of questions and things like that. So I would make lists of all these thoughts and questions and ideas that occurred to me when I was reading through these books, and write them up and go over them with the writer, and we would brainstorm back and forth about what to do with these things. If anything, sometimes we'd hit a dead end, but other times it would open up whole new areas to explore.
One of the things that I recall from this time is not only are you editing books, but you're also working on your own series. And I believe you had, through Epic Imprint, your own series, Alien Legion.
Right.
I'm wondering, how do you sort of manage the time that you're doing the stuff that Marvel's paying you to do, which is to be an editor, to make sure your books are out on time and look as good as they can, but at the same time, hit your deadlines for your own stories that you're trying to tell, and still have time to sleep and maybe eat?
Well, that's when I started getting all this gray hair. But what I did is, with Alien Legion, I ended up coming up with the basic concept and some of the main characters and the original storylines, but I did not have time, because I was editing, to actually do any hands-on scripting or drawing, except for character designs. So I brought on a couple of co-creators, Alan Zalnitz and Frank Sirocco. We all worked at that all out together, and they ended up writing and drawing under my direction the original run of the series. So that way I was overseeing the series. As almost like editing another book, but it was at the Epic department. When I went on to write and do the layouts for Punisher War Journal, that was a real problem. So I proposed that it be on a 6-week schedule instead of a monthly schedule. That would allow me to write it and do the layouts. But it became such a huge hit so quickly that the sales department was screaming for it to go monthly. If they could, they would have probably had it go daily. Jim Lee had come up through my office doing Alpha Flight for about a year, and he didn't really need anybody doing layouts for him at that point. So I finally just bit the bullet and said, okay, we'll go monthly, I'll just write it. And so we took on from there. So there were time management issues. Also around that time, I got married, started a family. So I was really being, having my attention pulled in a lot of directions. So I had to try and manage all that as well as possible. But the thing is when you're doing things you enjoy, it's much easier to handle a whole lot of work and be scattered in different directions than if you're doing a bunch of stuff that feels like drudgery. And all that stuff I took great pleasure in, so it was great.
And when you're working with Jim Lee on the Punisher War Journal, this is sort of transforming a character who's sort of the anti-hero. And I think when Jerry Conway and I don't know if it was Ross Andrew or John Romita who had created him.
Well, John Romita did the design, but I think Ross Andrew drew the stories, the original stories. Yeah.
And he was sort of created as a villain of the month, somebody who could keep Spidey occupied for an issue or two. But now you've sort of got to flesh him out and turn him into a character that's sympathetic to an audience. So how do you do that?
I think that the I had no real plans to use the Punisher, but then Joe Duffy, who she was an assistant to Archie Goodwin, and she had also been writing for Marvel for a long time. She had a nice long run on Power Man and Iron Fist, and she was proposing a Punisher graphic novel called Assassin's Guild, which Jorge Savino ended up doing the art on. At around the same time that I was approached by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck with their 5-issue miniseries proposal. I liked the proposal. I always loved Zeck's work, was interested in working with him. And I'd seen in the marketplace outside of comics with films like the Dirty Harry films or the Charles Bronson Death Wish films that there seemed to be something in the, the ether about, this sort of thing. So I signed on to do those projects, even though a lot of the other editors thought it was pretty silly to try and turn the Punisher into a leading character. And it took me a little while, but I came up with a take on the character that I tried to make sure all of the books I either edited or wrote adhered to as much as possible. Although things that were done with the character outside of my office or whatever, after I started editing it, I take great issue with a lot of it. But to me, he was a man who, it could have easily been called the Punished. He was punishing himself. He had a death wish for failing to protect his family when they were rubbed out by the mob. And his death wish involves him going after violent criminals to hopefully prevent other people from having to endure what he endured. And if he ever fails and gets killed, he's getting what he deserves for failing to protect his family. And he takes no pleasure, even if he has a successful mission. He doesn't kick back and have a beer and have a feeling of accomplishment. He's just driven to go to the next and the next and the next one. And on the rare occasion where he did start feeling like emotion towards somebody else or taking pleasure in something, he would cut himself off short because he didn't deserve that. Or if he got close to anybody because of his lifestyle, almost always they'd get killed or maimed or something. The longest survivor was Microchip, which was a creation of Mike Barron's. So I wanted to make it clear that, this was an action-adventure thing. It was sort of a cathartic thing where people who are really horrible but escape the law get their comeuppance, but it wasn't meant to be a role model in any way, shape, or form. But some people did not see it that way. And I'd occasionally get letters from people who thought, oh, I want to be just like the Punisher, and I'd have to stop whatever I'm doing and write them a letter back explaining everything I just told you and how this is nobody to be emulated and it's nobody that's happy. And they usually just end up inciting ongoing cycles of violence. They hardly ever actually solve anything. And I was always kind of amazed that point of view of the character didn't always come across because I thought we were putting it in there. But after editorial control went elsewhere in the character, I think they just lost all sight of any of the stuff I've just talked about. And people just thought he was a guy who was mad and went around hunting criminals. And they started doing things where we'd started out doing profiles of the equipment and the weapons that he used on a separate page, and that got taken over by somebody else who was writing it, and they started slipping in their own backstory in there that drove me batty. Like they had him in his downtime. First off, he never has any downtime, but in his downtime, he supposedly goes bear hunting, and they had him be a member of the NRA. They had him have a torture chamber built into his warehouse. These are things to me that are totally against the version of the character that I was in charge of. Also, you get people that want to guest star the character just because he was popular, and they go, "Oh, he's a guy who's mad at criminals and kills them, so we'll have him go berserk and shoot jaywalkers and litterbugs." And it's like, the easiest, stupidest idea for a story with a character. And when I was in charge of the character, I'd always nix those things. But when I wasn't, a lot of that stuff started happening. There was some really good stuff done after I stopped editing the character, but there was also just a lot of stuff I thought was ridiculous. And I don't think it's an accident that the popularity of the character started sliding around that time. It was just so inconsistent and weird. That's just my subjective point of view on the character.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, on the one hand, you've got this tremendous success with a character, and I guess that's, you know, that's great for the ego because it sort of validates what you're doing. But on the other hand, this is a character that's owned by Marvel and now is owned by Disney, and you know, you have to sort of give it back and give control. So how do you balance that? Your success with the character's not really yours.
Everybody who goes into the game of working for a major company's, you know, personal intellectual property, you know the rules going in. So if you don't like the rules, don't play that game. And the other thing that happened around the time I started at Marvel, that Marvel did, was that if you created a new character that was within their universe, their fictional universe, they had what's called the New Character Agreement, which gave you a percentage of the back end if it was licensed for merchandise or film or television and so on. And they've modified those agreements over time. You know, each new ownership wants to modify it, and so some people do and some people don't. It depends on how much, you know, money that's being waved in front of them to alter their deal. It wasn't like if you created a character from Marvel at that point, you know, you would never see any of the fruits of its exploitation down the road. So that was fine. If it was a character like the Punisher who was created before that time, with that agreement, then nobody involved would get anything from it. But if you created a new character within the Punisher mythos, like when Mike Baron and Klaus Janson created Microchip, they did get a piece of Microchip. So when Microchip ended up being used, for instance, in the Netflix Punisher series, I'm sure they got a paycheck for that.
You shepherded new artists at Marvel, and now you are sort of guiding the artists of the future in your role at the School of the Visual Arts in New York. So I'm wondering, how do you go from being a comics pro to being a comics professor? Was a great segue, right?
The mentoring had always come naturally to me at Marvel, and it just seemed like a natural segue to me. And I'd done a little bit of teaching and seminars here and there, but I'd had lunch one day with Klaus Janson, who'd been teaching a long time at the School of Visual Arts in New York, and I told him I was very interested in teaching there. So he put in a word with the chairman of that department, and they ended up starting another section of the senior portfolio class that I co-taught with Klaus for the first year, get my legs under me, and then I took over solo for a while. And then I ended up joining up with another former Marvel and DC editor and writer, Joey Cavalieri, to teach together. He and I make a pretty good team. We have a lot of things that we see in common and a lot of things that we have different takes on. So it's the students are getting like multiple points of view while still having us agree on a lot of the basics. So I think that's very helpful. Then I started teaching online as well for Academy of Art University, and it's based in San Francisco. They have a major online component in addition to their on-site school. When I was at SVA a while, I decided to propose a new course that I wrote called Creating Fictional Worlds. And a lot of the students have their own ideas for their own story worlds that they're trying to build. And so I have them build a Bible, so to speak, around their intellectual property that has a log line and a synopsis and the script for the first episode and outlines for the rest. It has turnarounds for all the characters and schematics for all the major scene environments. And talks about the rules and internal logic of the world if it has any fantastic elements. If you have a fantasy, science fiction, or horror world, it's important for the creator to know what the rules of those worlds are, what can and can't be done, what the capabilities and limitations are. Otherwise, you just start writing something because there's magic there, or science fiction. You get these very unsatisfying Deus Ex Machina type events coming on because you don't know what people can or can't do. And part of the creative fun is to know the limitations and figure out how your character butts up against them and figures out a way around them within the logic of that universe. And so I try and make sure all that stuff is worked out. So they know their property inside and out. So if they go ahead and start working on it, they're set. They know what they're doing. Or they can, if they want, they can use that Bible or use it to help pitch their project to publishers or editors or producers.
You're talking about the pitch, and I'm familiar with a pitch for television where maybe you just have a paragraph that you can use to sort of describe your show. So what would a pitch be like in comics? Let's say you were going to DC or Marvel and you had an idea for a new character or an existing character with a new take. How are you going to kind of pitch that to them?
I think a lot of that depends on your position in the industry and your relationship with whoever it is you're talking to. If you have a long track record and a good relationship, you can get away with a lot less because they have confidence in you. They know what you're capable of. If you're new or untried, you need to really have a polished act together, and it would include I think a really good log line. There's a template I like to use that comes from the Save the Cat books, a template for writing log lines. The Save the Cat books I have a real love-hate relationship with because I think there's some great information in there, but too many people, follow the beat sheet that he has there and write it religiously along that, and they can end up with a beautifully crafted and totally soulless piece of work. I teach my students it's best to combine a combination of the creatively inspired and intellectual approach to writing. So I have them figure out their basic plot, like they need to know their character, where the character starts, where they want the character to end up, and the general route they're going to take. And then I tell them to write the first draft totally from their gut. Don't worry about beat sheets or classic story arcs. They've got the classic story arc built into them almost anyway because of all the stuff they've been reading their whole life. And then take that first draft and, when you're doing it, just impulses, whatever that hits you, directions you want to explore, you can always cut them back. But if you following a beat sheet and you never explore them to begin with, you won't know what you might discover. So you take that, meandering thing that you come up with the first draft, then you compare that to like Chris Fogler's Hero's Journey model, which is based on Campbell, or the Save the Cat beat sheet, or any of the others that are out there that are very similar. They're all very similar. They just emphasize different things a little differently. And then ask yourself where your first draft diverges from that. Would your story be better if it did adhere more closely to that classic story arc, or would it not? And you have to be as honest with yourself as you can. And more often than not, I find that, gosh darn it, I guess I should make this adhere because it would be better if I did that, but not always. And the only way you'll know if you've come up with something that really works, even though it's a bit different, is if you let yourself explore in that first draft without being riveted to a beat sheet. That's why I think the Save the Cat beat sheet is like a two-edged sword.
A lot of times we tend to think of the story as a series of events, whereas really we should be thinking about the way the character grows and moves throughout these events. So how do you sort of explain that difference? Like, I've got a galactic space battle. So how would you kind of steer a student towards understanding that the character is the important part?
Well, basically, if you're doing a self-contained story, it's much easier to have a really strong character arc because they have their wants and needs, and they also have their conscious wants and needs as well as their subconscious wants and needs. So someone who, say, is desiring to be respected by their peers consciously, subconsciously, they might have they might not feel that way at all. They might feel that they're totally not worthy of any of that. So that's in conflict within themselves, and that's what affects their relationships with the other characters throughout the story. So you have to find out what your main character's fault or missing piece is, or information they're lacking, and within the scope of the arc of the story, they find out what that is, and that how they need to address it. And if they address it successfully, you end up with a happy ending, because when the final conflict comes, they have the ability and the tools to triumph. Or if they're unsuccessful, you have a more tragic ending. And then a lot of endings are mixed, so you have sort of ironic ending in a way, I guess, because it's a mixed thing. When you're doing a serial character like Spider-Man, you can't, every issue, you can't go through some giant arc. So a lot of times it's a matter of his morals and his convictions being tested each issue. He's Spider-Man, he's, by failing to save his uncle when he had a chance because he was being selfish, after that he's compelled to use his abilities whenever he can to help others and not let that happen again. And there are times when that gets tested, and his conviction to that, especially when he has needs and wants and desires in his personal life, or his commitment to helping other people in his civilian disguise.
Carl, I think we've just about run out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.